So we have with us today for our panel on the Syrian conflict and the shape that it may take in future, three panelists. Ms. Mona Yacoubian from Stimson Center, where she is a senior advisor for the Middle East and the project director for Pathways to Progress. We have Mr. Robert Zarate, the policy director of Foreign Policy Initiative, and Mr. Radwan Ziadeh, who is currently the fellow at Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and also the executive director at the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to take much of the time of the panel because I know that we are running behind schedule, way behind schedule. So I'm just going to ask Ms. Yacoubian to come and please start the session with her, then we'll move on to the other panelists.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Let me also try to keep my remarks somewhat brief so that we can get to discussion. What I'd like to do is really just three things. One is simply provide my perspective on where Syria is today. Secondly is to take a step back and try to understand a little bit better what the dynamics are that have been propelling this conflict. And then finally conclude with maybe a few thoughts on what the way forward might be. So in terms of where we are today, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are seeing Syria really, frankly, dying before our eyes. It has been a horrific conflict now coming upon its second year anniversary. My fear is that Syria could go the way of Lebanon, the way that Lebanon went during its civil war, 15-year-long civil war. That is to say, a dissolution or a fragmentation of the country, although I think in the case of Syria, the implications, the ramifications would be even greater. This is a country of 23 million people. It is strategically located in the heart of the Middle East. And I think in many ways it is becoming a test case for a much deeper question about the pressures and the tensions that come with sectarianism and the role of minorities in the Levant. And we can talk about this more in the question and answer, but I really want to say I think the implications of what's happening in Syria today are really significant. In terms of where we're at, the latest UN estimate is that 70,000 people have been killed. There are numerous articles and others that question even that. And the fact of the matter is hard, objective information on what's happening inside Syria is extremely difficult to come by. The number of killed could be far higher. More than 870,000 Syrian refugees have been registered to date with UNHCR. That number is projected to rise to 1 million. Frankly, at one point it was estimated perhaps by June. At the rate we're going, it's going to be far sooner than June that happens. Inside the country, there is a humanitarian disaster that is unfolding before our eyes. The number of internally displaced people in Syria is estimated at 2.5 million. The number of Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance ranges between 4 and 5 million. And again, these estimates may be quite low because of the inability of international humanitarian aid agencies to get into the northern part of Syria, which is a rebel-held area, and other parts of Syria that are rebel-held, as well as the very, very dangerous security situation that pertains around the country. There are issues now with hunger, with disease. For example, it was just reported that there's been a typhoid breakout in the eastern city of Deir Zor. There are issues about food security because much of the agricultural land is now in areas that have been receiving heavy fighting, and as well the ability even to transport food around the country is much diminished because of fuel shortages and because of, again, because of the security situation. In a very recent blog post, Josh Landis, who's the editor of Syria Comment, a fairly prominent Syria blog, estimated that perhaps 50% of Syrians today are living in poverty. So it is a conflict of enormous human dimensions, one whose tragedy, I think, really frankly, cannot be overestimated. In terms of the conflict dynamics and what it is that's driving this conflict, I think what we've seen in Syria over the past 2 years, without a doubt, has been a situation that on the ground is rapidly evolving and dynamic. But I would put to you that I think throughout the last 2 years, 3 factors have remained constant. And it is the interplay of these 3 factors, I would argue, that has led Syria to go from a peaceful uprising, peaceful protests, to now what I think many would term a sectarian civil war. What are those 3 factors? The first is, I would argue that from day one, the Syrian regime has viewed any protest, peaceful or otherwise, as being nothing short of an existential threat. And I would say this includes the very beginning of the graffiti written on the walls by the young teens in Deraa that precipitated a very harsh response by the Syrian intelligence services. That being the case, I think it explains why the Syrian regime has no interest in negotiation, has not made any sort of reforms, and I would argue will not do that. That there is really no Yemen option, if you will, for Syria. Second factor is that from the beginning, the Syrian opposition has been riven by differences. Ideological, personal. They have really to date been unable to attract significant, and I underscore the word significant, elements from Syria's minority populations, from the Christians, from the Alawites, from the Kurds. They have not been able to present a vision of a post-Assad Syria that would provide clear guarantees for all communities. And the third factor is that the international community has been blocked by a stalemate, has been unable to reach a consensus on how to move forward. This is most dramatically illustrated at the UN in the Security Council, where the US and European allies on the one hand and Russia and China on the other have been at loggerheads and unable to come to any sort of consensus on how to move the ball forward, essentially rendering the UN ineffective. And I think the stalemate serving as a green light, if you will, to the Syrian regime, and now sadly I think others as well on the ground, to continue with fighting, which is growing more intense, more horrific with every passing day. I would just note that the UN Human Rights Council on Monday issued its latest report, and it describes the conflict as becoming, quote, increasingly sectarian, with the conduct of the parties, and both parties, becoming significantly more radicalized and militarized. The Syrian regime stands accused of both crimes against humanity and war crimes. The armed opposition groups also stand accused of committing war crimes. So we've seen, as this conflict has gone on, deepening radicalization on the ground, and again, an injection of a sectarian element. Now, many will argue that this was the narrative that the Syrian regime put forth, and that may well be the case initially, but it has now taken on a life of its own on the ground inside Syria. And it is, I think, from my perspective, that sectarian dynamic that is very, very frightening, both in terms of its implications for how the conflict in Syria is eventually resolved, and also for its impact on the region around it. Syria, as you all know, is surrounded by volatile countries, Lebanon, Iraq in particular, that have their own issues with sectarianism, Turkey as well, with its Kurdish minority. More broadly, I think we are seeing the fabric of Syrian society fray in very, very concerning ways. There have already been signs in some ways of soft partition, of groups in mixed areas moving out of mixed areas and into areas where they would feel more safe. We see minorities, such as the Christians and the Alawites in particular, arming themselves, taking arms from the government to form these sort of self-defense groups. All of these are indicators of a society that is fracturing in ways that I think are very concerning. So let me now move to, so what is the way forward? Obviously, there's no easy way forward for Syria. Had there been, I don't think we would be having this conversation today. The Obama administration has come under withering criticism for its inaction on Syria. My own sense, and we can talk about this in the discussion period, is that there are, frankly, some good reasons for its caution. But I don't believe that it has done nearly enough. So what should the international community, in this case specifically the United States, do going forward? From my perspective, there is not a military solution to this conflict. It is going to have to be resolved by politics. When and how you get to that, and of course there are many that say war is simply politics, using arms. How you get to a political solution is the conundrum for Syria. I think I would argue for really three key steps going forward. The first is one of needing to treat the manifestations of what's happened. Essentially, the humanitarian situation in Syria must be addressed with much greater engagement by the international community, by the United States specifically. What can be done? Well, first of all, as of a few weeks ago, $1.5 billion have been pledged to assist the UN in its humanitarian efforts. But to date, not much of that has materialized. I think the United States needs to spearhead an effort to ensure that those that have pledged money produce the pledges that they've made. And of course, this is only going to take Syria into the summer. And sadly, this is a situation that is predicted to go on for some time. So much more needs to be done, both to raise additional funds and to ensure that those pledges are honored, and most importantly, that the assistance gets to its intended recipients. That's the second point on this. Much more has to be done to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches Syrian civilians who are essentially living horrific lives in rebel-held territories. The UN's record on this is minimal. It was only a few weeks ago that one of the first UN convoys was able to reach Azaz up near in the north near the border of Turkey. It had to take an incredibly circuitous route with the supplies arriving by air near Latakia and basically having to traverse the country to get there. Much more needs to be done, both in terms of pressuring the Syrian government, which is refusing to allow assistance into rebel-held areas, and in the absence of that, then more creativity by the UN, by the US, by the EU, and by others to work with international and regional and local NGOs who are operating in northern Syria and other areas that are rebel-held to ensure that this very badly needed assistance gets there. Finally, on the point of humanitarian assistance, as I've noted, there are tens of thousands, or actually hundreds of thousands, of Syrian refugees. I believe the number, as I said before, is about more than 870,000 in the countries surrounding Syria. They too are living in dire conditions. The countries that are hosting them themselves are dealing, both in the case of Lebanon in particular, Iraq has far fewer refugees, but with their own sectarian tensions, but more importantly with the strain on these countries' economies and infrastructure in hosting these refugees. In particular, I would point to the case of Jordan, which really has its own budget and its own capacity to to host Syrian refugees stretched to the max. So more has to be done to ensure that resources get to these host countries who have been thus far generous in keeping their borders essentially open. Turkey maybe a little less so. Second point of my 3 points is that while the U.S. professes to be doing some work on working with provisional councils, local councils, civil society organizations on the ground inside Syria, I would argue that much more needs to be done. That in some ways, one can begin to build the new Syria from the grassroots up in areas where government authority has essentially receded, and where these councils are already forming and functioning in the ways that government authorities had done in the past in terms of provision of basic services and so forth. I think that there can be more creative ways to engage with these groups, mapping out informal networks that are on the ground, ensuring that they get the material assistance that they need as well as the training. And I would add to that that more needs to be done to begin to address the sectarian tensions on the ground, that there should be more efforts at intracommunal dialogue, for example, to help begin to heal some of these wounds. Final point, and I'm gonna close here, is that I continue to be one who is a proponent of, again, a negotiated outcome. I do not believe that Bashar al-Assad should stay in Syria, nor do I think that he will willingly go. But I do think, as difficult as it is, there is some space in between where elements of the Syrian government could remain, and that there are elements within the opposition that would be willing to be negotiating partners, and that whether it's under the auspices of the UN or the Arab League, I would note that today, for example, the Russians have spoken more forcefully on the need for dialogue, but that's the way to go. I know it's not, for many, the solution one wants to hear, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk more about the possibilities of arming and other things. My own sense is that arming the opposition will protract the conflict and will deepen it. And that for Syria to emerge from this as a multi-sectarian, ideally democratic Syria, the solution must be one that is political. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for your remarks. Can I please ask Mr. Zarate to please come in?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the host for inviting me to do this, and also say it's a pleasure to be on stage, not only with Ms. Yacoubian from the Stimson Center, but also Radwan Ziadeh, who I've known, gotten to become acquainted with over the last 2 years. I believe I first heard him speak in May 2011 at the Council on Foreign Relations when you were giving a talk, and I had just left Capitol Hill, where I had served for many years as a staffer. And I've always looked to Radwan as a source of information and also inspiration in what is turned out to be a true tragedy in the Middle East. I'll try to keep my comments short because I know we are running late, but I guess I'll begin with a saying in Washington, D.C., and I'm paraphrasing here. It's often attributed to the State Department that could be attributed to any aspect of the U.S. government, but when the State Department or the U.S. government is confronted with a situation, often policymakers will claim that there's not actually a problem. But once the facts on the ground change, and they're forced to concede that there's a problem, they'll deny that there's any real solution. And time will go on, and perhaps with a clarity of retrospect, we will see that there are things we could have done in the past to affect the outcome or affect the flow of the situation, but we chose not to do. In which case they'll say, well, it's now too late. And sadly, that it's sort of an inside joke among Washingtonians, but there's truth to it. And I'm saddened to say that this observation applies to what's happening in Syria today. regarding with what Ms. Yacoubian said, I would say I agree with 95% of it. I would differ in certain areas in the sense that I get that there is no military option, that in a sense, in very real senses, the solution is political, but that said, the situation on the ground is militarized. It continues to be militarized. In a moment, I'll speak a bit about U.S. policy, and I should also add, my comments will sort of be from the point of view of what I think U.S. policy should be, and with also a sense of what it has been. I think what's deeply problematic for me, I'm at a 501c3, not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization called the Foreign Policy Initiative, and we spend a lot of time talking with folks on Capitol Hill as well as the executive and the media. I've also gotten to know members of the Syrian opposition, both expatriate and also within the country. I think that there was a moment in August 2011, about 6 or 7 months into the conflict, when President Obama, I think at that point 2,000 people in Syria had died due to the conflict, and President Obama made a policy statement that Bashar al-Assad must go. And since that time, almost nearly about a year and a half or so has passed. And what we see today is Assad is there. He is weakened militarily, politically. There's a continuing live debate as to whether his regime is mortally wounded or whether this will persist for some time. I regret that I'm preparing myself and I'm steeling myself for a situation that will persist and that this death toll will mount. I hope it doesn't, but I believe it will. And I think my overall thesis too will be that the United States must change its policy to do more to bring an end to this conflict. My point here is that the United States has both interests and moral interests, I should add to, not just strategic economic interests or what have you, but a moral interest in not only seeing Assad go, but in also how he goes. And in no small part, it is not just because of the truly tragic dimensions of this humanitarian disaster, but also because of things that the Assad regime has militarily. The Assad regime does have chemical weapons and other military things that are very, very problematic. And what's worse too, we've seen that the violence spill over to neighboring regions. It's spilled over to Turkey. I think in part that's why you've seen so-called Patriot defense missile embattlements put at the border. They're also in Jordan. In part, they're meant to help protect the territorial integrity of Turkey, at least against missile attacks. There is also a possibility that some of these units can be used for extending soft air defense, which is to say partial no-fly zones. For example, the units in Turkey, especially the so-called PAC-2 units, in theory could be used to extend a partial limited no-fly zone over the provinces of Idlib and I'm sorry, I'm blanking here, over Idlib and Aleppo. However, I think for different reasons, the Obama administration has made a policy decision that it just simply doesn't want to, in its point of view, militarize the conflict. But that said, the violence has spilled over into Turkey, into Lebanon. We've seen also Israel. What reportedly seems to be military action against certain aspects of the Assad regime military. And this is a crisis that frankly is spiraling out of control. And it is important not only with respect to what's going on in Syria, to just the dignity of the various ethnicities and peoples of Syria, but it's also important for regional security and global stability. This could spread to, the violence could very much spread to neighbors and truly destabilize the region. Now, another area in which I'd like to talk a little bit, in closing I should say, is what I think are some of the main drivers of this situation. One, I believe that the Islamic Republic of Iran, in particular the Quds force of the IRGC, have been a driver. They have been providing support to the Assad regime's military, both technological. They've been training snipers. The Russian government also has been a source of comfort to the Assad regime, and has steeled Assad towards struggling in the long haul. And I know that there's a lot of debate as to the extent to which Russia can be a constructive partner in actually bringing a peaceful solution. Russia has, to be frank, very many interests in Syria. I believe Syria is its fourth largest, the Assad regime is its fourth largest consumer of military wares. And you know, every so often, I think actually for the last 6 months, there's been hope that Putin and for him Medvedev, but Putin could be pressured and prevailed upon to basically tell Assad to go, and that Assad would go peacefully and perhaps find himself exiled in who knows, Russia or elsewhere. But I think if people actually did hope that, and I think there was serious hope for that, especially last year, early last year, I'm increasingly skeptical that anything like this will happen. But also on the other side too. Now, there's something called the Friends of Syria. It's a collection of, let's see, 40-some countries, including the United States, France.
114.
I'm sorry,
114.
Sorry, I was off by an order of magnitude there. 114. It includes also Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and you know I think one of the biggest problems regarding the Friends of Syria, and I of course will defer here to Radwan, who can probably speak at length about the problems. But that I think only one country, frankly, in the world has the gravitas and the wherewithal and the capacity to actually coordinate all those member countries of the Friends of Syria organization, and that is the United States. And it has not done that. And what we have seen is actually the fractures within the so-called Friends of Syria grouping exacerbate the tensions, the fissures on the ground. Which is to say, you know, you will have elements of governments, say in Qatar or Saudi Arabia, supporting those groups whom they most favor, providing them with arms, providing them with funds. You will see other European nations working with their groups. And at the same time, in a parallel process, the United States, the State Department, led a process to create a successor to the Syrian National Council, which was viewed as a representative of the Syrian people, by some governments a sole representative. The creation of the so-called Syria Opposition Council. The National Council has a much longer, complicated name. That council has been recognized by many governments as the sole, or I should say some governments as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. The United States, which played a powerful role in creating this entity, has so far refused to recognize it as the sole representative, but rather as a sole representative. And moreover, what this also means is that the United States, within the USAID development, foreign assistance development community, there's a great hesitance to empower the SOC with humanitarian aid as the main provider of it. In essence, they would prefer to do it on their own and not give the SOC, if you really do want to empower it as these sort of civilian political focal point, to empower it with the tools it needs to actually have that legitimacy. And I think that's a conundrum which we need to take seriously. And I know, as a former staffer on the Hill, there are lots of lawmakers who are trying to think through this problem seriously and force actions in the executive. And last, with regards to the opposition, the armed opposition groups, I always talk about the opposition in plural, in the sense that they're groups. They're not monolithic. Though there have been, I think there has been progress. There is a Supreme Military Council that was established with a defector named General Idris, who is now head of it. And it does have some meaningful control of certain elements of the so-called Free Syrian Army. And to the extent that I think the United States has some important decisions to make. I know that there's a live debate as to the extent whether the United States should arm groups. That said, they are being armed already. So that in a sense is a fact on the ground. The question is the extent to which the United States should do it. I understand the concerns about providing arms. I will say, wherever you fall in that debate, I do believe there are other things you can do, which we're not doing, which is, for example, providing assistance to members of the Supreme Military Council in Syria on international humanitarian law. Teaching them and teaching them to be trainers to commanders below. The laws of war, Geneva, all that stuff. And that's something we're not doing. In addition, you know, in terms of other forms of assistance to the armed opposition, I mean, it ranges from providing intelligence just about movements of the Assad regime military, to providing hospital field hospital gear because the armed opposition groups face sometimes injuries that they suffer under more normal conditions might not be fatal, but because of the lack of field hospital equipment are fatal. And last, in terms of humanitarian aid, and something I know that I gather that Ms. Yacoubian is very passionate about. I mean, just to cite an example, a lot of the UN aid is now, the Assad regime is demanding that the aid be channeled through Damascus, not through Turkey, not through the neighboring countries, but through Damascus and brought through via convoy. And of course, that increases the chance that this humanitarian aid and those who transport it will be targeted. And you know, the United States can. My understanding from discussions with members of the opposition is they've been in different ways trying to send messages to the executive branch, especially to the White House and to the State Department, that there are things you can do besides just simply handing over RPGs or this or that can actually make meaningful differences in the conflict, especially in terms of the provision of assistance to the armed groups. And I think that's something that we actually need to talk about seriously. You know, aside from the extremes, there are meaningful things we can do. I guess I'll close on that. I probably have more to say in the Q&A, but I really do look forward to discussing this situation, this crisis, with all of you and to hearing your perspectives and views. Thank you.
May I call upon our final speaker, Mr. Radwan Ziadeh, to please share with us his views.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the organizers, and thanks for Muna and Rob. They said many things actually I would like to do. I will focus my comments here on three issues. First, there is no sectarian conflict in Syria. It's easy to say that because much of the experts sometimes they don't know exactly how the situation inside Syria and how it goes. What started in Syria as a peaceful revolution, and this is a popular revolution. There is no leaderless, ideologyless, and there is no one can take decision to take arms. It's gradually started, and basically in September 2011, when the Syrian revolution started as peaceful revolution until September 2011, 6,200 has been killed. What the Syrian got in this 6 months statements, some support, some moral support, and nothing else. And this 6 months where all the Syrians, they call for responsibility to protect, which this is something applied in Syria, and this is something the UN actually developed in 2005. And before of that, we thought that the international law system, international justice law system, has been developed in a way that not such kind of crimes against humanity or war crimes to happen. And basically, after the establishment of the ICC International Criminal Court in July 2002, after the war crimes and crimes against humanity in Bosnia and Kosovo and other places. But unfortunately, Syria telling us different story, where actually war crimes and crimes against humanity can happen, and the international community can do nothing about it. And this is why what pushed the Syrians to take arms, basically the massacres in different places has been happened in Syria, basically in Hawla, in Al-Qubayr, in Daraya, which my hometown Daraya. The inhabitants of this city, which is very close to Damascus, 7 kilometers, it's more than 240,000. What's left in Daraya right now, only 2,000. All of this has been actually enforced to leave the city, including my family. I just back yesterday from Cairo and Amman, where I left my brother. I never seen him for almost 7 years because I cannot get in the country and he cannot get out of the country. He's been smuggled in to Amman, where actually a horrific situation, not only in Daraya but in different places in Damascus suburbs. which still actually responsibility to protect apply in Syria. Even that there is now the two sides taking on. But let's see in details. Yesterday, as example, the Assad regime confirmed used the Scud missiles again in Aleppo, and 41 civilians has been killed in Aleppo. Of course, the opposition they don't have Patriot. They don't have even that's less than that to defend themselves. And according to the UN itself, 80% of the victims are civilians and killed by the arms and indiscriminate killings of the Assad regime. And this is why, this is what. The US, as example, considered the Scud missiles in Iraq under Saddam Hussein as WMD. But in Syria, nothing to do about it. But this is the double standard again, where actually sometimes the international community decided not to do anything and to leave the situation like what we have right now. It's a severe humanitarian crisis. Mona mentioned some numbers, even that the numbers, of course, much higher because nothing. The main source of the instability is still there with the Assad. Then, if we need to address the humanitarian crisis or situation without dealing with the source of who's making the cause of the humanitarian crisis, then actually we are dealing with the consequences rather than dealing with the real cause of the crisis. Of course, everyone believes there is a political solution, and even that in Bosnia there was a political settlement. But who can convince or can enforce Bashar Assad to accept this political solution? This is the question, and this is why we say if without using the force against Bashar Assad, there is no political settlement at the end. That's clear, and have many situations around the world happened before. In Bosnia, as example, Holbrooke, which last year, still he believed in the last minute that Milosevic will be maybe part of the solution, and we have negotiated with him. At the end, when the United States used the target air strikes, which for 38 days, then that ended the crisis there. The same situation we have here, wasting time, of course, wasting sources, negotiations, and the conferences with the conferences of the Friends of Syria. We have one coming up in Rome, which more than 114 useless countries meeting, discussing, and of course they have, in the last meeting in Marrakesh, we have a statement of 35 pages. Even that we don't have an action plans for that. This is why those countries actually recognize the coalition, but they said finally this is actually political recognition, not legal recognition. This is, none of them actually deliver what Iran as a one country delivered to the Assad regime. Iran pledged to Assad regime to give $1 billion through assistance, through weapons, and none of these countries actually deliver what they promises in Marrakesh. This is why we said clearly we don't need more conferences like the Friends of Syria conferences if there is no action plan which can put an end to the crisis. And this is why in any situation in international relations, we have 4 steps. The first steps, of course, we have negotiations, international envoys, and we've been tried that through Kofi Annan before, through Akhdar al-Brahimi, and through different international envoys like the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs. The second step, of course, be sanctions. When unfortunately the sanctions now has been affected the Syrian people, the Syrian population rather than the Assad regime. Of course, the lack of the electricity, lack of oil in the city, it's actually one of the consequences and the symptoms of the humanitarian crisis. If you go to the northern part of Syria, there is no electricity, no water, and this is part of the sanctions. Then the third step, it should be actually taking actions, especially prosecution. And unfortunately, the ICC International Criminal Court cannot, or the prosecutor there cannot open investigation because Syria is not part of Rome Statute, and the Security Council was unable. Yeah, just today morning, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, he said that this is not a productive step to agree on the Swiss initiative, which more than 55 countries called the Security Council to refer the crimes and war crimes in Syria to the ICC. Then the third step, the use of force, which unfortunately the US position has stopped on the sanctions since August 2011 and doesn't want to move, despite of the moving situation on the ground and basically militarily. And when I hear some statements from some officials, we don't need further militarization of the situation in Syria. Well, this is like insulting statements. How can more militarization of the use? Until now, according to the NATO itself, the Assad regime used 42 Scud missiles. 42. In normal wars, we don't have use of such kind of long-range missiles. And of course, with 35 to 41 airstrikes every day, which of course left more than 80,000 has been killed according to the UN, which of 5,000 every month, approximately 5,000 every month. If we compare this situation to other situations, we have civil war. Let's assume in Syria have a civil war, which we rejected because it's not a civil war. It's a war. Let's compare to the Peru, where actually they have civil war from in 1980 until 2000 between the Shining Bhat and the security forces, the government security forces. In this 20 years war, more than 60,000 has been killed, according to, of course, the final report of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Syria, less than 2 years, we have more than 80,000 has been killed. This is not like civil war, even that on the international standards, because that's a huge number of people being killed day by day by the Assad forces. Then the second point I want to mention here, of course, regarding the armed opposition. The main problem of the armed opposition in Syria, there is no central command. As I said, it's a different city, and this is something I think our responsibility to do more, to tell the stories about the people who's actually now fighting. We call them as freedom fighters. They are fighting in my hometown in Daraya. We don't have any actually of defected soldiers or officials, because we don't have. But of course, the sons of the city start taking arms. We have 5 doctors killed in the city because they are taking arms to defend themselves after the huge massacres. Then this is why the armed opposition, they have the popular support within the country, because actually those are from each city, from each town, they know. But with the same time, when you have a situation like we don't have central command to take strategic decisions, there is many things can happen, like less coordination. Some groups became radicalized, like Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Sham and other Salafi groups who got the support from some Salafi businessmen in Bahrain and Kuwait. And that's, of course, it changed the course a little bit. With the same time, building a central command, it's need international involvement. And this is something we call the US to help in. The US has to do a central command to help to negotiation and to help actually to build coordination between different groups of the armed opposition. Because before giving arms to the armed opposition, before of that, you have to train them You have to build a central command to be able to take strategic decisions, and this is the case right now. After almost 5 months of coordinating between different groups, now the Free Syrian Army in much more organized way, there is no attacks on any of the civilians, of the Alawite civilian towns. Even that there is some intention for some groups to do after the massacres taken, but now it's most of all the attacks, especially on the military bases of the Assad regime. The Assad has 26 military airports, and those are actually the focal points, or all the fighter jets, the military helicopters, and the Shillings. They use these 26 military bases, and this is why the Free Syrian Army, much of the focus on how to take out these military bases, and this is not an easy, because you have to take an advanced weapons, and this is something the Free Syrian Army been calling the international community to provide. Until the Free Syrian Army was able to take out 3 of these military bases, Al-Jarrah and Taftanaz, and in the south, Marj al-Sultan. But that's with a huge number of people being killed there, because those military bases are very far isolated, and if you come close, of course you will be easily targeted by the Air Force. This is why they need insistence, they need an advanced weapons to be able to take off these military bases. The final comments about the future, of course, is not an easy. And revolution has never been an easy, especially like the situation in Syria, where now confirmed Hezbollah fighting inside Syria and killing Syrians inside Syria, where Iran, they have interest and to have a civil war, because having a piece of the cake much better to have nothing. And of course the same with the political support of the Russians, and no real support of the 114 countries of friends of Syria, then you will end up, you have to take your own war. And this is what's happened, where the Syrian, now they're insisting to fight until to the end. But of course then the consequences of that will be difficult. This is why we started some initiative which is really important to keep the fabric of the Syrian society, because if we get inside, the Assad regime is insisting to go Syria into the civil war, and this is something really important. The Alawite, it's 10% of the Syrian society. Or let's have another example, the Copts in Egypt. Their percentage in the population is almost 6 to 7. How much in the Copts in the state public sector? Less than 1%.
0.
2 or less than 1 or 2. The Alawite in Syria is 10%. How much they have employee in the public sector in Syria? 62%. We have a social problem. And this is why it's not an easy to say that we love you to the Alawites or of that. They see that there is a change in the social fabric in Syria, because they actually keep securing all the high posts in the military, in the army, in the education, in different places. And this is why they insisted to fight with the Assad regime. And we say there is no intention to have a fight with the Alawite as a community, but this is something that has to be changed. And this is why the difficulties, and the Assad regime knows that. And this is why from the day when he's armed all the Alawite community and keep the Alawite towns, especially in the northern parts of Syria, keep arming them and provide them, and those working as a shabiha. And this is why the Assad is insisting to go to the civil war, because at the end there is in his interest for Syria to have, as I said, a piece of the cake. But in the other side, the political opposition, it's a clear discourse that we have no interest to go to the civil war, and we have to avoid that by any means. This is why we start some initiatives about transitional justice. We formed a preparatory committee, National Committee for Transitional Justice, in last month in Istanbul in Turkey, and that include 3 Alawite members in the committee. And when you have some Alawites calling Bashar Assad and all to prosecute all the arms committed inside Syria, it's really an important step. But with the same time, you should not have an illusion that you will get 100 support from the Alawite in your side. This is not the case, because basically most of the armed and the security are Alawite, and they have their own interest to fight with the Assad regime. And this is, and I will end here, that will be a long fight if the international community decided just to watch, not to take actions. And I end by. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 questions, so if anybody is interested. I'm really sorry we have really short of time.
Anybody have 2 questions? Together.
Yeah.
I can speak for me. My question is that why we see now inside Syria there are extremists, and if the answer is violence, would violence be the solution for a Syrian situation? Just as simple as that.
I mean, after, if you are in a position that your brother been killed and your mother or sister been raped, of course, as individual answer for that, you will see that the best answer to do that, to take anything may you have in your room, or you can buy something, and we have many cases where actually people sell their properties to buy guns or to do something to defend themselves. And this is, if this happened on your town level, and massacres, when the Assad or the security forces get inside any of the towns, their massacres has been committed, like what's happened in Al-Hawla, Daraya, and other places. But we always say there is many things we should be in the future. The revenge should be not be as a public policy for the opposition. And this is we trying actually to avoid to isolate any sectarian voice within the opposition. There is many voices, maybe, of course, but should in the political opposition and the armed opposition leadership, we have to isolate and avoid a revenge or a violence to be a public policy. There is some individual incidents we cannot avoid, and we try actually to avoid, but that's happened. This is a natural response to what's happened. But again, most important thing for such sectarian language has to be not to be as a public policy.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. The cause, though, I would say is not violence, but rather vacuum, which is to say nature pours a vacuum and it fills it somehow, and similarly in Syria there has been a vacuum. In particular, what we saw was armed groups looking for aid, and in part there were two main things that happened. One, entities within certain Gulf countries, provided funding and arms to transshipment points, etc. And they armed groups that had certain ideologies. And so that's been part of the problem. It's been an assistance, a lack of competition and provision of sources of assistance to actual groups who are willing to uphold, for example, the Syrian Support Group, which is a US and Europe-based group, has a proclamation of principles which they've gotten certain military commanders to adhere to. And if Western and other Arab countries had supported that effort more forthrightly, we may not have this sort of issue. Another issue, though, is the Assad regime itself. During the Iraq War, it provided assistance to Sunni groups, foreign fighters, who went to Iraq. And many of those fighters have crossed over and are now participating in this conflict, given its increasing sectarian dimensions. And so the Assad regime, and there's an interesting story which I think has come up now where there was a debate between then Deputy National Security Advisor L.L.M and then Commander of U.S. Forces in Iraq, David Petraeus, over bombing the Damascus airport during the Iraq War, I believe it was 2005, 2006, because the Assad regime was using it to fly foreign fighters into Iraq. And so I think, on a certain level, my last point here too is that I think, in August 2001, when President Obama, had talked about getting rid of Assad, a major argument against getting greater U.S. involvement was that the problem of terrorism or extremism would grow, for example, that the violence would just grow. And what we've seen is, I would argue, because the Obama administration and the United States has chosen to stay essentially on the sidelines, it has actually allowed that problem. It has created the vacuum and has been a main driver for a lot of those problems. And it's regrettable. We heard in closing in recent hearings, congressional hearings, Secretary of Defense Panetta, outgoing, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, then Director of Central Intelligence David Petraeus. They all had supported a plan to actually provide more indirect, it's called indirect intervention, some level of armed assistance to certain groups, vetted groups. President Obama and his national security advisor vetoed it, even though his main advisors counseled it. And I think until the president decides, he has decision to make, basically. Whether or not, again, as I said, we don't have an interest just in seeing Assad go, but in how he goes. And so long as we're on the sidelines, so to speak, we will have little say.
I thank all our panelists. I'm really sorry we are very short of time, but I'm sure if they're willing, then you can probably take the discussion outside of this room. I'll call on the LL.M board president, Mr. Alberto Mendez, the vice president, Rana Yunus, and the secretary, Isabella Ringwera, to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presence. Thanks for our speakers to be here this day. I want to thank to Rana Jones, the Vice President of Academic Affairs of the LL.M Board of the International Legal Studies Program from American University. She was really concerned about this issue, to have a forum of one day of 3 different panels of the main issues in the Middle East. I want to thank Isabella Reguerena, the General Secretary of the LL.M Board and one of our moderators during the second panel related with Palestine. I want to thank to all the members of the LL.M Board who were here, Rodrigue, Mohammed, Marine, everyone who were supporting this event. It was a really, really complex event, and we need to keep working in that. One of the goals of the LL.M Board and one of the goals of the International Legal Studies Program is to make these kind of events, these professional events, these academic events for all the community, not only in American University, but in different parts. Our speakers, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming. We will keep working with that. And I only want to say shukran, like it's in Arabic. Sorry about my bad Arabic. And thanks for coming. And well, thanks for, see you in the next event of the LL.M Board. Thank you very much.